All right, everyone, strap in. This time on the deep dive, we're diving headfirst into a political storm.
Yeah, you guys sent us a ton of articles, and it looks like things are getting really intense between former President Trump and, well, the FBI.
It's definitely explosive. And we're not just talking a war of words. This thing's got potential firings, restructuring, even accusations of weaponization being thrown around. It could completely change how law enforcement works in America.
No kidding. And I bet everyone's wondering the same thing. Is this like a correction, right? Like, is the system messed up and this is how it gets fixed? Or is this just a straight up power grab, something that could really hurt our democracy?
That is the big question, isn't it? To really get this, we got to look at how fast and hard Trump's been moving. The guy gets back in office and boom, he's going right at the FBI. One article even called it like a political purge.
And he's not just talking, is he? I mean, he's fired some pretty important FBI people, right? And a lot of them were involved in those investigations against him. Russia, January 6th, even the stuff with the documents of Mar-a-Lago. Right, and that's where things get really interesting. Think about the message that sends. If you're an FBI agent and you're doing your job, following the rules, but you worry that could put you on some politician's bad side, are you going to hesitate next time you get a sensitive case?
I see what you mean. That's kind of scary. But hold on. Some people say that the Mueller investigation, the one that came from the FBI looking into Russia in the first place, that actually found stuff like real contacts between Trump's people and Russia. Doesn't that make the FBI look right to be worried?
It definitely makes it tough to just say it was all a witch hunt, right? Like the Mueller report, it didn't find enough to say Trump's team actually conspired with Russia, but it also didn't let Trump completely off the hook when it came to obstructing justice. There's a lot of gray area, so both sides can point to the parts that support their view.
And this brings us to the real fight, doesn't it? Because the FBI, they're not just sitting there and taking it, they're pushing back.
Yeah, they are. The acting director, Driscoll, and some other big names in the FBI, they're flat out refusing to give up lists of agents who worked on those Trump investigations, basically saying, we're not going to be your political pawns.
And people are saying this whole thing is like a constitutional crisis, right? That phrase gets thrown around a lot, but what makes this situation so serious?
Well, it's like the different parts of government, the ones that are supposed to keep each other in check, they're breaking down. The Justice Department, the ones in charge of the FBI, they're saying the FBI is disobeying. Trump's talking about firing thousands of agents. Then you got FBI agents themselves suing the government, saying their rights are being violated. This is some uncharted territory for sure.
Wow. It's messy. And amidst all this, people are comparing it more and more to Watergate.
Yeah, the similarities are pretty striking. Back then, Nixon tried to control the Justice Department too, and that caused a huge crisis about who has power and whether laws even matter anymore. This feels kind of similar.
So let's say, just for a second, Trump manages to really get control over the FBI like this. What would that mean for law enforcement in the future?
Well, that's a really bad example, doesn't it? Any president after this, doesn't matter what party, could decide to use the FBI to go after their rivals or protect their own people from investigations.
Okay, that's not a good thought at all. But we have to at least consider the other side of this too. Trump and the people who support him, they're saying this isn't about hurting democracy, it's about fixing a system that's been used against him unfairly.
They're saying the FBI has had it out for Trump for years, and they point to stuff like how they handled Hillary Clinton's emails as proof. They say Clinton got special treatment even though she mishandled classified information.
But the FBI investigated her, right? I mean, they looked into it a lot and decided not to charge her with a crime. How did Trump and his people explain that if they think the FBI is biased?
Their take is that the decision not to prosecute was all political. They think it was to avoid causing trouble during an election.
So what we're seeing is that people don't even trust the institutions that are supposed to uphold the law, right? They think it's all about politics.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. It shows how divided we are about what law enforcement is supposed to be doing. It erodes trust in the very systems that are there to protect us.
Which brings us back to the core of all this. Can the FBI, or any law enforcement agency for that matter, ever really be depoliticized? Can we get politics out of it?
That's the ideal,
Yeah.
right? You want them to just look at the facts, the evidence, and not care who's on what side politically. But making that happen in the real world, that's incredibly difficult.
Because even if everyone was a perfect robot with no biases, the FBI is still part of a political system, right? Politicians appoint them, Congress gives them money, and they have to enforce laws that politicians write.
Exactly. That idea of a totally neutral, apolitical police force. It's a nice thought, but probably not realistic.
Okay, so if perfect neutrality is off the table, what's the best we can do? How do we at least make things more fair and accountable?
Well, for starters, we got to make sure that the people in charge of the FBI, the leadership, that they're chosen because they're qualified and experienced, not because they're somebody's political buddy.
So, like, you pick the FBI director based on merit, not on who they donated to or something?
Exactly. And then, when someone gets picked, there should be serious hearings to confirm them, where everyone really looks at their qualifications, whether they'll be fair, and whether they get what the FBI's role is in a democracy.
And it can't just be the top guy, right? There has to be a way to make sure that politics doesn't get into investigations, no matter who's doing them.
Right. You need clear rules, good training, and strong ways to oversee what's going on so personal biases don't mess up investigations.
But oversight from who? Who keeps an eye on the people who are supposed to be keeping an eye on things?
You need a few things working together. Congressional committees are part of it, but they can get caught up in politics too.
So what else? Like independent groups that watch what's going on?
Yeah, you need independent watchdogs inside the Justice Department and also outside groups like the Government Accountability Office. They can keep things in check and make sure the FBI is following the rules and doing things ethically.
And don't the courts have a role, too?
Definitely. The courts are there to make sure the FBI is doing things according to the Constitution, that they're not breaking the law while they're trying to enforce it.
So it's kind of like checks and balances, right? Nobody has all the power, and everyone's being watched.
That's the idea. Don't forget, the public has a huge role to play, too. We have to hold the FBI accountable.
Right. How do we do that?
Well, a free press is super important. They can uncover stuff if people are abusing their power, and they can call out the FBI if they're doing things wrong.
And what about regular people? Like, what can we do?
We can stay informed, think critically about what we hear, and demand that our elected officials and the FBI be transparent. Don't let them hide stuff.
So basically, participate in our democracy. Don't just let it happen around us.
Exactly. If we want a healthy democracy, we have to be active and involved and hold the people in power accountable.
This deep dive has been intense. We started with this conflict between Trump and the FBI, but we've ended up talking about some really deep stuff, like the foundation of our whole system of government.
And we've talked about some big questions, right? Who has power? What does rule of law really mean? And how do we make sure institutions that are part of the political system can still be fair?
And I think it's clear that there aren't easy answers here. There's no quick fix. But at least now we have a better understanding of what's going on, and we can think critically about what we want law enforcement to be in our country.
And at the end of the day, it's up to each of us as citizens to decide what kind of future we want and to make sure our leaders are fighting for justice, fairness, and accountability.
Well said. And we're going to keep watching this story as it develops, and we'll keep analyzing what's happening and asking these big questions about law enforcement and democracy.
When you talk about the FBI being biased against Trump, the Russia investigation is like the main thing they bring up. They say it was all based on weak evidence, that it was just a political attack, and that it was meant to make people think his presidency wasn't legitimate.
Okay, but do they have, like, specific examples, or is it just kind of general complaining?
Oh, they have specifics. They point to this thing called the Steele dossier. It was a bunch of reports, like intelligence gathering, that said Trump's campaign was working with Russia. But later on, a lot of it was found to be false or misleading. And Trump's people say the FBI, they relied on this dossier way too much, even used it to get permission to spy on people.
But didn't Robert Mueller, the special counsel, look into all this for years? What did his investigation find?
That's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
Mueller's report, it did say that Russia messed with our election, but it didn't say Trump's campaign actually conspired with them.
So could it be that there were some real worries at first, but the FBI went too far with the investigation?
That's exactly what Trump and his supporters say. They think the FBI just didn't like Trump, and they were looking for anything to get him, even if it meant stretching the truth or overstepping their boundaries.
But hold on, Mueller's report didn't clear Trump when it came to obstructing justice, right? That makes things a little less black and white, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It means there were things Trump did that probably should have been looked into more, even if they weren't technically crimes. And that just adds fuel to the fire, right? Because now both sides can say, see, we were right to be worried.
Okay, so the Russia thing is a whole mess on its own. What about those other things Trump's supporters bring up, like the stuff about Hunter Biden's laptop or that whole deep state idea?
Oh, those are definitely part of their argument, too. They say that the FBI, they basically ignored or downplayed stuff that could hurt Democrats, like the allegations about Hunter Biden and his business deals, but they went after anything that could make Trump look bad.
But the FBI has said over and over that they're not biased. They say they just follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Right, that's what they say. But Trump and his supporters, they say the FBI's actions tell a different story. They see a pattern, like the FBI is intentionally targeting Trump and anyone who supports him.
So how are we supposed to figure out what's true? It feels like everyone's just yelling accusations and it's hard to know who to believe.
Yeah, that's the tough part these days. There's so much information out there, and it's hard to know what's real and what's spin.
If we can't even trust the FBI to be unbiased, who can we trust? Where do we even go to get real information anymore?
That's a question we all got to think about. It shows how important it is to think critically, to understand how the media works, and to look at stuff from different sources. Don't just get your news from one place.
That brings us back to that big question from before. Can we ever really have a depoliticized FBI, or is that just a fantasy?
The good goal, right? We want law enforcement that's just focused on the facts and the evidence, doesn't care about politics, but that's really, really hard to do in real life.
Yeah, because even if everyone could just shut off their personal opinions, the FBI is still part of the government, and the government is all about politics. Politicians choose who runs the FBI, Congress gives them money, and the laws they enforce are written by politicians.
Exactly. So that whole idea of a police force that's totally neutral and doesn't get involved in politics, that's probably just a dream.
Okay, so let's be realistic. If perfect neutrality is impossible, what's the best we can hope for? How do we at least make things more fair?
Well, one big thing is to make sure the people in charge of the FBI are picked because they're qualified and experienced, not because they're friends with the right politicians.
You're saying pick the FBI director based on merit, like how good they are at their job, not who they supported in the election.
Exactly. And those confirmation hearings they have for nominees, those should be super serious. Really dig into their qualifications, make sure they're committed to being fair, and make sure they understand what the FBI is supposed to be doing in a democracy.
And it can't just be about who's at the top, right? We need a system where politics doesn't have any influence on investigations, no matter who's doing them.
Absolutely. That means clear rules, strong training, and good ways to watch over what's going on. You have to make sure personal opinions don't mess things up.
But who does the watching over? Who keeps an eye on the people who are supposed to be keeping an eye on things?
You need a few layers of oversight. Congressional committees are part of it, but they can be biased too.
So maybe like independent groups, people who aren't connected to the government.
Yeah, you need those watchdogs, both inside the Justice Department and also independent groups outside of it, like the Government Accountability Office. They can make sure the FBI is playing by the rules and doing things ethically.
And what about the courts? Don't they have some power over the FBI?
For sure. The courts are there to make sure the FBI is following the Constitution, that they're not breaking laws while trying to enforce them.
It's like that whole checks and balances thing, right? Nobody's too powerful and everyone has someone looking over their shoulder.
That's the goal. And here's something people forget. The public has a big role to play, too. We're the ones who have to hold the FBI accountable.
Wait, how do we do that? Most of us aren't lawyers or politicians.
It starts with having a free press. They can investigate and expose stuff if people in power are abusing their authority. They can call out the FBI if they're doing something wrong.
And what about regular people? What can we do to keep the FBI in check?
Well, we can start by staying informed, right? We have to pay attention to what's going on. Then think critically about what you hear. Don't just believe everything you read. And don't be afraid to demand transparency from our leaders and from the FBI. Don't let them sweep things under the rug.
So we have to be active participants in our democracy. Can't just sit back and watch.
You got it. If we want a democracy that works, we can't be passive. We have to be involved, and we have to hold the people in power accountable, no matter who they are.
You know, it's easy to get lost in all the details, all the back and forth, but I keep thinking about something more basic. What does it even mean to have a depoliticized FBI? Like, can you actually do that?
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? It's something people have been arguing about for ages. It's complicated, that's for sure.
Because even if everyone in the FBI could somehow, like, turn off their own political opinions, they're still working inside a system that eyes political. The people who run the FBI, they're appointed by politicians, Congress gives them the money to operate, and they're out there enforcing laws that, guess what, politicians wrote.
You're absolutely right. So maybe that whole idea, a law enforcement agency that's totally neutral, no politics involved at all, maybe that's just a nice idea that doesn't work in reality.
So if we can't have perfect neutrality, what's the next best thing? What can we do to make things as fair and unbiased as we can?
One big thing is making sure that the people at the top of the FBI, the leaders, are chosen because they're actually good at what they do, not because they're somebody's political friend.
Like a merit-based system, right? You pick the FBI director based on their skills and experience, not who they supported in the last election.
Exactly. And when you're picking someone for that job, those confirmation hearings, the ones where Congress asks them questions, those need to be really thorough. Dig deep into their qualifications, make sure they're committed to being fair, and that they understand the FBI's place in a democracy.
But it's not enough to just focus on the top, right? There needs to be a way to make sure politics doesn't get into any investigation, no matter who's working on it.
You got it. That means you need clear guidelines that everyone follows, really good training for agents, and strong systems in place to oversee everything that's going on. You can't let personal biases mess up an investigation.
And who does the overseeing? Who watches the people who are watching the FBI?
It can't be just one thing. You need multiple layers. Congressional committees have a part to play, but they can get political too, like we said.
So maybe you need independent groups, people who aren't part of the government, to keep an eye on things too.
Right. You need these watchdogs, both inside the Justice Department and outside of it. Groups like the Government Accountability Office, they can make sure the FBI is following the rules and doing things the right way, ethically.
What about the courts? Don't they have some power over what the FBI can and can't do?
Absolutely. The courts are really important because they're there to make sure the FBI is following the Constitution, that they're not breaking laws while they're trying to enforce laws.
It's that whole checks and balances thing again, right? Like in the government, no one person or group has all the power and everyone's got someone looking over their shoulder.
That's the idea. And something else to remember. The public has a really big role to play here. We're the ones who ultimately have to hold the FBI accountable.
Wait, but how do we do that? I mean, most people aren't lawyers or politicians or anything.
Well, first off, we need a free press. They can investigate things, and if someone in power is doing something wrong, they can expose it. They can hold the FBI's feet to the fire.
And what about just everyday people? What can we do to make sure the FBI is doing its job the right way?
The most important thing is to stay informed. Pay attention to what's going on.
Hmm.
But don't just blindly believe everything you hear. Think critically about the information you're getting. And if something seems fishy, don't be afraid to ask questions. Demand that our leaders and the FBI be transparent. Don't let them hide things.
So we can't just be passive. We have to be active participants in our democracy, right?
Right.
If something is wrong, we have to speak up.
You got it. A healthy democracy needs people who are engaged, who pay attention, and are willing to hold those in power accountable, no matter who those people are.
Well, this deep dive has really been something else. We started talking about Trump and the FBI, and we ended up talking about some really big, fundamental stuff about how our government works.
We really went deep, didn't we? We talked about the balance of power, what rule of law really means, and how do you make sure that institutions that are part of a political system can still be fair and unbiased.
And it seems like there's no easy answers, no simple solution to any of this. But at least now we have a better idea of what the problems are, and we can start thinking critically about what role we want law enforcement to play in our country.
At the end of the day, it's up to each of us as citizens to decide what kind of future we want. And we have to make sure that our leaders, the people we elect, are committed to things like justice, fairness, and accountability, that they're working to make that future a reality.
Well said. And as for this whole situation, we're going to keep following it closely. We'll keep analyzing the news and asking these tough questions about law enforcement and democracy. And we hope you'll do the same. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those questions coming. This is The Deep Dive. Signing off.